It has long been theorized that the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, as described in the Bible, if interpreted literally, could only have been a psychedelic mushroom. Though a mushroom may not be what you think of when you hear the word tree, they do have roots, a trunk, provide shade, respirate, have cell walls, and bear fruit, thus fitting much of a tree's criteria. Archaeology reveals that mushrooms once stood dozens of feet high, and some scientists even claim that they preceded the evolutionary advent of trees in general. Mushrooms without stems, known as shelf fungi, almost exclusively grow on tree trunks. The word fruit applies just as much to a mushroom as it does a berry, since they are both the reproductive organs for their respective organisms. The Bible even provides us with an early definition of fruit, when in the 28th verse of the first chapter in Genesis, God instructs man and woman to be fruitful and multiply. Many fungi are toxic, and thus we can see how mushrooms, as a whole, warranted the admonitions given in the book of Genesis. We also need remember that man was created as a wholly frugivorous and herbivorous species. Man's original factory settings, in the Garden of Eden, were entirely opposed to the consumption of any living creature. Since mushrooms are somewhat in between plant and animal, we can see how they may have garnered an additional taboo. The second chapter of Genesis tells us that this tree was in the midst of the garden, which could either mean in the middle of, during, or spread throughout. There is nothing stopping a mushroom from growing in the very center of a garden, or all over a garden, but it is known for a fact that the fungal colonies which spawn mushrooms can easily span an entire garden, with some specimens encompassing multiple square miles of land, thus meeting the criteria for in the midst of the garden. The serpent with the tree is reminiscent of the caduceus, which has long been the symbol for medicine and pharmacology. Many serpents are known for climbing trees, but not many people realize the depth of connection between snakes and mushrooms. In the minds of ancient man, living a horticultural lifestyle, free from war and strife, the mushroom and the venomous snake would have been his two greatest and most prevalent natural threats. Coming in contact with the wrong one could result in death. Few are aware that snakes and toads actually use mushrooms as bait, preying on insects which become delirious after coming in contact with the fruit or its spores. Certain species of snakes even render themselves poisonous by consuming poisonous frogs or toads, who derive their own poison from their own diet, which often includes intoxicated insects and even the fruiting body of psychedelic mushrooms itself. Some snakes are even known to consume mushrooms, possibly for hydration. The bioaccumulation of mushroom-derived toxins is so strong in certain snakes and turtles that humans have long been advised against eating them. Then there is the matter of serpent imagery, being inextricably linked to experiences had on magic mushrooms. Snakes are one of the most commonly reported images seen by those having hallucinogenic experiences. The Aztec were particularly interested in seeing snakes, while using their so-called flesh of the gods. Taking this a step further, shamans who claim to have mapped out the framework of reality itself, using magic mushrooms, often boil life and the passage of time down to a divine serpentine energy, which pervades all time and space, whose slithering is the very mechanism by which the material world was created. Serpents and mushrooms have been depicted in the same works of art by nearly every ancient culture. The second and third chapters of Genesis tell us that the penalty for eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil was to die. The serpent, however, informed Mother Eve that she would not die, and it turns out that he was correct. To die without dying, as the result of eating a fruit, is hardly equatable to anything other than a psychedelic experience, and the so-called ego death which often results. Admittedly, the concept of ego death has been heavily watered down by pretentious navel-gazers, but those tripping on mushrooms frequently report a feeling of death, overcoming death, seeing what happens when we die, or even realizing that death is an illusion. The serpent also tells Eve that her eyes will be opened, and that turns out to be true as well. One's pupils quite literally open, meaning dilate, after ingesting magic mushrooms. Eyes being opened as an expression for epiphany and revelation would also fit the bill for a mushroom trip, as this symptom is reported by the vast majority of participants. The serpent also tells the woman that after eating the fruit they, quote, shall be as gods and know good from evil. God or his angels end up confirming this to be true. Identifying oneself with God is almost universally reported by participants of mushroom trips. Other variations would include seeing God, talking to God, or realizing that everything and everyone is God. Knowledge of good and evil could mean a lot of things, but when interpreted literally, it is rather cut and dry. With the exception of a near-death experience, few things are capable of rewiring a person's moral compass for the better, quite like a hallucinogenic experience. When Genesis tells us that the woman saw the forbidden fruit was good for food and pleasant to the eyes, it somewhat implies that we are not talking about a fatally toxic berry, but rather a sufficient source of nutrition, combined with an alluring appearance. Magic mushrooms certainly fit that bill. The book of Genesis then tells us that the fruit was one to be desired to make one wise. Many berries can deliver a toxic and even hallucinogenic effect, but none have ever been shown to bestow wisdom beyond general improved brain health. Magic mushrooms, however, are frequently credited by great artists and thinkers alike as having shifted their perception for the better. The book of Genesis then tells us that after eating the fruit, man and woman knew they were naked. Many people who take magic mushrooms feel a compulsion to take their clothes off, and some do not even notice until they are already off. It is also worth noting that mushrooms are among the most phallic organisms on Earth, and may have altered the way humans perceive their own genitalia. Ancient Christians not only identified magic mushrooms with the forbidden fruit, but even with Jesus himself. The influence which reindeer shamans, fly agaric, and winter solstice ceremonies had on the popular Santa Claus myth and Jesus' generally celebrated birthday is irrefutable. There are many who believe that consuming the body of Christ originally referred to the ritualistic consumption of magic mushrooms, which have long been nicknamed things like flesh of the gods and bread of the gods. Such is the definition of the native Mexican name for psilocybin, teonanacal. The following comes to us from the United States Forest Service. Quote, much of our understanding of religion in the Americas comes from the eyewitness written accounts of Spanish priests of the ritual and or medicinal use of psychoactive mushrooms by Native Americans during the early exploratory period in Mesoamerica. In 1656, Francisco Hernandez de Toledo, physician to the King of Spain, wrote a guide for missionaries to the New World, in which he described the various mushrooms that were eaten by the natives, including some species that caused a kind of madness, bringing, quote, before the eyes all kinds of things, such as wars and the likeness of demons. The majority of these mushroom cults used liberty caps, or various types of psilocybin. Some accounts note that the mushrooms were mixed with mezcal, a naturally fermented beverage obtained from agaves and drunk like wine. It was also known to be mixed with chocolate. Over generations, many later scholars dismissed these early accounts as fiction. In the late 1930s, a young Harvard botanist, Richard Evans Schultes, made history by his pioneering studies of shamanistic mushroom use by Indians in the state of Oaxaca, Mexico. The statue of the Aztec god of flowers, Xochipilli, is housed at the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. He is covered head to toe with various entheogenic plants, including teonanacal, mushrooms on his knees and earlobes. His trance-like face has been interpreted as being in a state of spiritual ecstasy. End quote. A work by the name of Hallucinogenic Drugs in Pre-Columbian Meso-American Cultures tells us that the Maya also consumed Psilocybe cubensis, known to them as Kaizalaj o Cox. These mushrooms were also consumed by the Huastec, Totonac, Mazatec, and Mixtec peoples. Since prehistoric times, the people of Teotihuacan have had the custom of grinding mushrooms with water on models of temples that were to be constructed, or on stones marked with petroglyphs. Furthermore, archaeological evidence points to mushroom use in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, where mushroom stones, carved to represent hallucinogenic mushrooms, have been found. In Caminaliljuyu, Guatemala, researchers found 9 mushroom stones whose stalks are decorated with anthropomorphic figures, demonstrating the pre-Hispanic custom of grinding sacred mushrooms into powder. Ritualistic use of mushrooms was also widespread in the Caribbean. Angel M. Nieves Rivera, with University of Puerto Rico, tells us in his 1995 work entitled Hallucinogens Used by Taino Indians in the West Indies that, quote, the distribution of hallucinogenic fungi has been reported for Cuba, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and the Lesser Antilles. Lowy, in 1971, indicated a relationship between the distribution of hallucinogenic mushroom and aboriginal sites. We observed a similar pattern in the distribution of hallucinogenic mushrooms and the Antillean archipelago sites where Taino culture developed. End quote. Having thus demonstrated the religious significance of magic mushrooms and its proximity of use to Florida, I'd like to discuss just what species actually grow in Florida. Despite being left off the list of destinations for many mushroom enthusiasts, the state of Florida abounds in psychedelic mushrooms. The 2 most famous types of mushrooms known around the world would have to be Psilocybe cubensis and fly agaric or Amanita muscaria. Psilocybe cubensis did not receive its official name or classification until 1949 from German mycologist Rolf Singer, but too few are aware that it had already been recorded in Florida by William Murrill as early as 1941, being designated Stropharia cyanescens. Psilocybe cubensis naturally occurs all across the Gulf of Mexico. Amanita muscaria was recorded throughout Florida until 2015, when the distinction was made between it and its nearly identical relative, Amanita persicina. This variety can be differentiated from the standard muscaria by its peachy color, thus earning it its nickname of peach-colored fly agaric. Thus, Amanita persicina can be found throughout the state of Florida, but Amanita muscaria is not. Persicina bears the same psychoactive properties as muscaria, meaning the native people of Florida had access to the same states of consciousness that Northern Europeans and Siberians did as well. Now I would like to introduce you to Florida's most unique and underappreciated psychedelic mushroom, Psilocybe tampanensis. That's right, Tampa's very own magic mushroom. For those unaware, Tampa Bay could easily be considered the psychoactive nerve center of the United States. Ybor City, a small historic district of Tampa Bay, in one of the very first places in America where Europeans shared tobacco with Indians, is not only the cigar capital of the world, but also the location of the United States' very first legal magic mushroom dispensary.
For the 7 o'clock hour, the first magic mushroom dispensary in the entire country is right here in the Sunshine State. Magic mushrooms are illegal, but just like Delta-8 marijuana, the version sold at the Tampa store is a weaker and legal dose that does not contain a mind-altering compound. The owner of the store says the shrooms at his store actually offer some benefits, but not everyone in the community is happy about it.
Psychedelics in general are very beneficial for trauma, PTSD, anxiety. And even microdosing can just help the average person get through the day.
My biggest concern is children getting in the wrong hands. The developing brain does not need to be exposed to this drug or any drug.
Well, right now there are no legal mushroom shops in Central Florida, as we said, but we could see some popping up soon.
Psilocybe tampanensis is perhaps best known on the drug market by the name of Philosopher's Stone, due to its pebble-like sclerotia, which are essentially psychedelic truffles. The mushroom and its sclerotia also has a very unique relationship with Florida's frequent pine fires, bringing to mind the legend of the phoenix. Psilocybe tampanensis is a very rare psychedelic mushroom in the family Hymenogastrecea. Originally collected in the wild in a sandy meadow near Tampa, Florida, in 1977, the fungus would not be found in Florida again until 44 years later. The original Florida specimen was cloned, and descendants remain in wide circulation. Fruit bodies, or mushrooms, produced by the fungus are yellowish-brown in color, with convex to conic caps, up to 2.4 centimeters in diameter, atop a thin stem, up to 6 centimeters long. Psilocybe tampanensis forms psychoactive truffle-like sclerotia that are known and sold under the nickname Philosopher's Stones. The fruit bodies and sclerotia consumed by some for recreational or entheogenic purposes. In nature, sclerotia are produced by the fungus as a rare form of protection from wildfires and other natural disasters. The species was described scientifically by Stephen H. Pollock and Mexican mycologist and psilocybin authority Gatson Guzman in a 1978 Mycotaxon publication. According to Paul Stamets, Pollock skipped a, quote, boring taxonomic conference near Tampa, Florida, to go mushroom hunting, and found a single specimen growing in a sand dune which he did not recognize. Pollock later cloned the specimen and produced a pure culture, which remains widely distributed today. The type specimen is kept at the herbarium of the Institut Politécnico Nacional in Mexico. Guzman classified Psilocybin tampanensis in his section, Mexicania. Guzman considers Psilocybe tampanensis to be intermediate in form between Psilocybe mexicana and Psilocybe carolensis. For almost 2 decades after its discovery, Psilocybe tampanensis was known only from the type locality, southeast of Brandon, Florida. In 1996, Guzman reported finding it in a meadow with sandy soil in a deciduous forest in Pearl River County, Mississippi, a habitat similar to that of the type location. Due to its scarcity, however, its habitat preferences are not known with certainty. Like all psilocybe species, it is saprobic. Like some other psychoactive grassland species, Psilocybe tampanensis can form sclerotia, a hardened mass of mycelia that is more resistant to adverse environmental conditions than normal mycelia. This truffle-like form gives the fungus some protection from wildfires and other natural disasters. Other psilocybe species known to produce sclerotia include Psilocybe mexicana and Psilocybe carolensis. Sclerotia are also produced when the species is grown in culture. Psilocybe tampanensis contains the psychedelic compounds psilocin and psilocybin, and is consumed for recreational and entheogenic purposes. The species was actually found to be one of the most popular psychoactive mushrooms confiscated by German authorities in a 2000 report, behind other varieties of psilocybe. According to mycologist Michael Boog, dried fruit bodies can contain up to 1% psilocybin and psilocin. In terms of psychoactive potency, Stamets considers the mushroom moderately to highly active. The psychoactive compounds are also present in the sclerotia. In one analysis, the levels of psilocybin attained from sclerotia ranged from 0.31% to 0.68% by dried weight. and were dependent upon the composition of the growth medium. Sclerotia are sold under the nickname Philosopher's stones. They have been described as resembling congealed muesli and having a somewhat bitter taste similar to walnut. Strains existing as commercial cultivation kits, sold originally in counterculture drug magazines, are derived from the original fruit body found by Pollock in Florida. Methods were originally developed by Pollock and later extended by Stamets in the 1980s to cultivate the sclerotia on a substrate of ryegrass and on straw. Sclerotia prepared in this way take from 3 to 12 weeks to develop. Pollock was granted a U.S. patent in 1981 for his method of producing sclerotia. Psilocin and psilocybin are scheduled drugs in many countries, and mushrooms containing them are prohibited by extension. In the United States, federal law was passed in 1971 that put the psychoactive components into the most restricted Schedule I category. For about 3 decades following this, several European countries remained relatively tolerant of mushroom use and possession. In the 2000s, in response to increases in prevalence and availability, all European countries banned possession or sale of psychedelic mushrooms. The Netherlands was the last country to enact such laws in 2008. However, they did not include psilocybin containing sclerotia in the 2008 law, and thus psilocybin containing fungal compounds are available commercially in the Netherlands. In parallel legal developments in Asia, psilocybin tampanensis was one of 13 psychoactive mushrooms specifically prohibited by law in Japan in 2002.
Alright, I'm here on May 7th, 2022 in northern Palm Beach County, and I'm sitting here in a landscaped mulch bed, and I want to show you what we've got. Right here is a mushroom in the genus Psilocybe known as Psilocybe niveo-tropicalis. It's a relatively rare psilocybe and has only been found a number of times in the last few years. It was originally thought to be Psilocybe ovoideo-cystidiata. We got some more here. But after DNA sequencing, it turned out to be something else. And yeah, this just grows in like wood chip landscaping areas. The reason I'm making this video is in hopes that more people will go out and observe this mushroom and give us a better idea of the seasonality and distribution of this mushroom. It's only been found a handful of times in the past few years, and it's been limited to Palm Beach County in South Florida. So hopefully after this video, people will go out and observe more finds of this psilocybe mushroom.